suicide vest.
And if that had gone off?
We're talking murder. We're talking maimed people.
In Muslim communities across the country, there's a small minority who support violent jihad.
British soldiers, we want them killed!
There is a state of war, and America have declared it.
That is the big word, isn't it?
The government is spending £140 million a year in a new strategy aimed at preventing the spread of extremism.
Prevent means getting the 16-year-old boy at school today that is attracted to the jihadi website to turn into a model citizen rather than a suicide bomber in 3 years' time.
But focusing on Britain's Muslims is controversial.
It's making people angry because they are being expected by the state to accept one or the other, either British, being British, or being Muslim.
I've travelled across Britain to investigate whether the new counter-terrorist strategy will really make us all safer or simply swell the ranks of Generation Jihad.
Hello, good morning, welcome to the Plymouth Breakfast Show. Weather today, going to be a dry day, going to see some sunny spells as well with a high of 18 degrees Celsius. And if you're on the roads, no problems to report.
In May 2008, Britain's counter-terrorist agencies received a disturbing wake-up call.
Everywhere, Muslims are suffering at the hands of Britain, Israel and America. We are sick of taking all the brutality from you.
That May morning, Nicky Riley set off for Exeter, carrying soft drinks bottles filled with deadly chemicals, his mind burning with hatred of those around him.
When you are getting drunk on Friday and Saturday night, your behaviour is worse than animals. You have sex in nightclub toilets. You urinate in shop doorways. It is unacceptable to Allah and the true religion, Islam.
As 22-year-old Riley walked into Exeter city centre, he was bent on revenge and ready to become a suicide bomber. Long before he set out that morning, police might have been able to stop him before he translated his anger into murderous action. Their failure forced government to rethink its counter-terrorist policy. Growing up, there was nothing to suggest that Riley was anything other than a lonely child from a broken home with behavioural problems.
It isn't a particularly happy family upbringing, and there's a real sense of anger towards those in authority, the police service, housing, other people. He suffered from Asperger's syndrome and other aspects of obsessive behaviour.
He became a bit of a loner, didn't actually engage particularly well with people within the area, and started to really identify with Islam. I suppose it felt to him that he would get help, support and friendship from within that community that he wasn't getting elsewhere.
A white boy from one of the most deprived estates in England, Riley discovered the world of violent jihad via the internet. In the privacy of his bedroom, he'd become obsessed with the 9/11 attacks on America. Soon he was chatting online to Muslim extremists thousands of miles away. Riley's new internet friends were in Pakistan, two in particular. They called themselves Adil and Huzaifa. Before long, they were encouraging him to become a martyr.
There were two main areas that he was speaking to them about. One was about potential targets for any attacks that he was planning, and talked about things like military bases, military sites, police station, market areas, that sort of thing. And the other aspect was he was seeking advice from them about the actual structure and makeup of the device he was intending to use.
Riley's mentors told him how to make a bomb. All the ingredients were on the shelves of his local hardware store. But the police did have an opportunity to put Riley under surveillance. In 2003, he told a psychiatrist that he wanted to study engineering, to learn how to build bombs and kill people. That ominous warning was passed on to the police. Did anybody talk to him? Any officer go and have a chat with him?
No, that was part of the threat assessment and the risk assessment that was taken, that it was felt that to actually physically approach him may well prompt him into doing something.
Did any of your officers go and talk to his mother?
Not as far as I'm aware, no. No.
That morning in Exeter city centre, Riley was on CCTV, but nowhere on the police radar.
Our words are dead until we give them life with our blood.
Riley entered a restaurant packed with young families, a distorted view of jihad running through his head.
You kill one of my people, I kill one of yours.
Riley went into the toilet, unpacked his crude bomb and primed it as he'd been instructed by his mentors. But the bomb exploded prematurely.
If the device had been detonated properly, then it would have actually maimed and killed many people in that restaurant.
Riley was blooded but unrepentant. He was later jailed for 19 years. The shockwaves reverberated across Britain. Counter-terrorist agencies had been looking for networks in big cities, not a white convert in the West Country.
It's very easy for us to say, looking back, and it's always the way with policing, why didn't you realise? Well, actually, the threat and the intelligence wasn't saying that the threat was coming from people like him. The thing that we have done is move very quickly to actually incorporate this type of profile, this type of event into future prevent thinking.
Nicky Riley shows what can happen when warnings aren't heeded. The 4 bombers who attacked London in July 2005, 7/7, are the most devastating example of this. Some were already on MI5's radar, but they slipped beneath it and murdered 52 people. The government responded with a new counter-terrorist strategy. Its aim was to
prevent people becoming terrorists or supporting violent extremism.
Prevent is the government's attempt to deal with extremism before it becomes terrorism. The aim is to encourage Britain's Muslims to warn the police about the tiny minority of would-be jihadis and to undermine the extremist ideology that leads to destruction and death. The government believes the key lies in engaging with moderate Muslims and getting mosques and madrasas, Islamic schools, to play their part. This homegrown threat from British jihadis like the 7/7 bombers is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. Stopping the enemy within has forced the government to take a hard look at the deep divisions within our multicultural society.
What we've done since 2005 is redoubled our efforts in getting close to the neighbourhoods where Muslim communities are in preponderance. So we're much closer to our Muslim communities than we ever were.
There's no doubt that Prevent does squarely target Britain's Muslims, but it's a high-risk strategy. The biggest risk of all is alienating the majority of Muslims whose support is needed for its success. But the police say they need more information from Britain's Muslims in order to tackle terrorism. It's a delicate issue because police have often been perceived to be heavy-handed and insensitive, the result being widespread mistrust.
This year in Manchester, when They just broke into a person's house, broke the doors down, pulled him away for questioning, and end of the day, nothing came out of it. So if you can pull somebody out of the house, when nothing comes out, I expect them to come on the television and apologize to that person for doing that. The police. The police, because that person has to live in the community, you know, and imagine his neighbors and friends seeing him being pulled out of the house.
These women from Blackburn have been invited by Lancashire Police to take part in a trust-building exercise, and there's a free lunch. The men have a separate session. There'll be a role-playing exercise designed to show the Muslim community what a tough job it is fighting terrorism and how difficult are the decisions the police have to make. They will be taken step by step through a terrorist incident in the fictional town of Sandford.
One of our sources has heard some information about an extreme group that appears to have bought a load of peroxide. I will let you know more information.
The women are told about a suspected terror cell in their neighbourhood. Playing the role of counter-terrorist officers, they have to decide what to do next.
The gossip hotspot of the...
Would you stop and search people on Nimrod Street?
No,
you wouldn't. Why
It's
not?
still too early in the case
Too early.
for us to do something so drastic.
Because they bought peroxide. In a stupid sense, it's not sufficient information to want to go and arrest somebody.
There's a none-too-subtle message behind the role play. If a community really wants to stop terrorism, they have to share information with the police.
You were saying about how to engage and things like that. I think
and it's also trying to get communities to understand how important intelligence is, how important it is for communities to come on board and share information with us. It's not about spying on communities. It's about how we can share information and work with each other.
And perception has changed the way how difficult it is to make decisions, because you are dealing with people's lives here.
You have to work that little bit harder to find out more information before you just go barging in.
Where do you think the best intelligence comes from?
The public, the community.
Whilst the government denies that Prevent is about spying, providing information and informing on your neighbours may amount to much the same thing, only the wording may be different.
I'm looking for the community to work much more closely with the police in identifying young people that that they have concerns about in terms of the people that they're mixing with, the sort of websites that they're going onto and the material that they're reading. Now, that information can only come from the community itself.
But in whatever terms it's couched, intelligence gathering is the key to stopping attacks on Britain's streets. In Bristol, the local Prevent strategy had only just got underway when the city faced an immediate threat. The story begins not on an inner-city housing estate, but in a picture postcard country village. It's easy to stereotype a Muslim extremist or a suicide bomber, but these stereotypes aren't always true. Islamist extremists don't always come from the most deprived areas of our land. This is the village of Frenchhay, just outside Bristol. It could easily be the setting for a Jane Austen costume drama. But in fact, it was the setting for a would-be suicide bomber. Frenchhay was home to Andrew Ibrahim. The family is well off. His Egyptian father is a surgeon at the local hospital, but Ibrahim got into drugs. After being expelled from a number of private schools, Ibrahim ended up on the streets, an addict, homeless, and selling the big issue. Ibrahim was brought up a Christian, but by the time he met Jack Everson, who was also a drug user, he'd converted to Islam. Why do you think he embraced Islam?
I think The possibility of belonging to a communal religion like Islam was very seductive because he'd been sort of marginalised so much by people in and around the town because of his drug use.
When you got to know him, was he always in Muslim dress?
He would change into sportswear, tracksuits, according to how he perceived himself at the time and how he wanted others to perceive him. And he saw changing his clothes and his style as a means to acceptance.
So he was quite obviously a confused young man.
Yeah, he did a lot of crack cocaine, which is, you know, obviously apparent effects.
Andrew Ibrahim, like Nicky Riley, was a Muslim convert. He taught himself Islam as a teenager and was easily impressed by an extreme interpretation of the faith. Perhaps because of his Egyptian heritage, he was fascinated by the Arab world.
One day, he showed me this video, and it was just footage of Osama bin Laden walking through some mountains, and it had Arabic writing and music in the background. And I don't think he wholly understood it, but the way he was looking at me, and he just had an air of expectation about him. It just seemed like he was expecting me to find it impressive or expecting to find it cool.
He was a little bit of basically a lost soul, looking for an identity. And I think that's when he went on to look at Islam as a way of getting himself perhaps clean from heroin, but also as a mechanism, a moral code for life for him to grow up through.
Ibrahim began a search for a mosque in Bristol that would satisfy his craving for a radical version of Islam, but they were all too moderate for him.
My understanding is he actually went and visited a number of mosques in Bristol on various aspects of the Islamic spectrum, and he never actually settled with one. And I know he'd been into at least 4 mosques, possibly more. And his interpretation, I think, a lot of it then came from the internet.
By April 2008, he'd become obsessed with carrying out a so-called martyrdom mission, scouting Bristol's Broadmead shopping centre as a target and buying bottles of peroxide from Boots.
Hi everyone, today's experiment is with HMTD or hexamethylene triperoxide diamine.
Ibrahim was studying chemistry at college and now used that knowledge to prepare for jihad. He even filmed his own experiment. But then the police struck lucky. A special branch officer received a call from a local mosque that had recently hosted a prevent role-playing exercise.
I received a phone call from one of our community contacts to say that they had concerns about a person in the community. They'd seen that he had burns on his hands. About 10-15 minutes later, I received a further call from the same person saying that he didn't think it could wait until the morning, and it was probably a little bit more serious than that. I asked him to explain why, and he said, we think he may have some explosives at his home address.
His colleague, Gary Ricketts, hurried straight to the contact.
He told me the man's name was Issa, that's all they knew, and that he was a white convert, that he'd had injuries to his hands which were pitted and reddening, it was described as, and that he'd been talking about suicide bombing and finding out people's views on it, whether it was good or bad.
The police quickly established that Issa was Andrew Ibrahim and that he probably needed medical treatment.
Because obviously there were injuries to his hands, etc., we decided to go and speak with the surgery that he was actually connected with to see if he'd been there. And as we were there making inquiries, believe it or not, actually, Andrew Ibrahim walked into the surgery.
It's a stroke of luck?
It was.
A surveillance team shadowed Ibrahim to the city centre. The fact that he was carrying a rucksack made them nervous. They decided to move in. Ibrahim was just 19 at the time.
How was he arrested?
At gunpoint with an arms team, we arrested him just in Princes Street in Bristol.
And what was his reaction?
He was stunned, as you could imagine. Being told to lay face down, I suppose, with a gun pointed at you is quite sobering. And he was basically arrested and placed into a vehicle and taken to Trinity Road Police Station.
Ibrahim told the police that there were explosives in his fridge. In the unlikely surroundings of Westbury-on-Trim, police discovered a bomb factory.
When the flat is searched, there was found hanging on the back of his bedroom door as a suicide vest. On the bed, there's a number of ball bearings. And there were 3 large tubs of nails and screws. 12 empty bottles of peroxide are found under the sink.
Empty bottles?
Empty bottles.
You find the distilled peroxide?
The actual house was covered in peroxide when it was tested. It's all over the place. And there is actually some footage of him testing the HMTD.
Like Nicky Riley, Ibrahim's target was also a shopping centre. He too saw Britain as a dirty toilet. Decadent Britons had to be punished.
Would the bomb have been viable? Would it have gone off?
According to the experts who've looked at it, yes. They believe that certainly with the component parts he had, the other chemicals which were stored underneath the sink, probably made in the region of an explosive device which could amount to about 11 hand grenades. And that could do a lot of damage.
And if that had gone off?
We're talking murder. We're talking maimed people. Impact on Bristol as a city would be catastrophic for years to come.
The police believe that the tip-off from within Bristol's Muslim community didn't happen by chance. They claim it was a direct result of their prevent strategy and the work of their community engagement team.
So where did the community engagement team begin? Why?
Well, it began in, actually the idea came in August 2007.
Gary Ricketts is a special branch sergeant. Normally he works undercover, but for the last 2 years he and his colleagues have come out into the open.
What are you trying to achieve?
We're trying to achieve a situation where the community have trust and confidence in us, are able to speak to us if they have any concerns.
You can't just move in and say, hello, I'm a special branch officer, trust me.
No, you can't. Which is why it's a long-term process. You can't just dip in and dip out. You need to be there regularly every week. And if you say you're going to be there on a Friday, you're there on a Friday.
But there are going to be people in the community who say, you know, you're a special branch. The fact that you're a special branch means you're a spy, because that's what special branch officers do.
Obviously, that's something that we have to address on a day-to-day basis if we get asked that question. And that is all about us saying to people, you know, the special branch have a role, and yes, there are maybe some covert parts of special branch, but that is not us.
Regular visits to Bristol's 10 mosques is a vital part of that work.
This is the Shah Jalal Mosque.
So if you were concerned about any individual in your community or in your mosque, then you would get in touch with Gary or one of his colleagues?
Sure. There's no without doubt.
And you know that Gary is a member of Special Branch?
Yes.
He knows.
We do.
I told him we went to the Shah Jalal. Oh, yeah. And met with Mr. Wahab.
Andrew Ibrahim was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Police claim it was their groundwork in forging links with Bristol's Muslim community that led to Ibrahim's arrest. They highlight it as a major success for Prevent.
Just approaching Bristol Central Mosque.
That information that came back through the community to the special branch, no doubt about it, we've actually stopped people being murdered in Bristol. You know, without their help, you know, there will be a lot of bereaving families in a moment.
But there is deep disquiet in some quarters of the Muslim community about where the climate of providing information, encouraged by Prevent, may eventually lead. In 2008, Rizwan Sabir was studying for a master's degree about Islamist terrorism at Nottingham University. When he arrived on campus one morning and popped into the gents, he wasn't expecting visitors.
As soon as I walked in, 3 police officers walked in, dressed in civil clothes, looking very concerned, saying, don't move, pretty loud. And they said, well, we're police officers. So they showed me their ID, and they said, who are you? And I said, well, I'm a student. And they said, OK, can you get your stuff? And follow us down to the car.
But when they got down to the car, the situation went from bad to worse. The police arrested him under the Terrorism Act.
My first response was, are you having a laugh? Thinking that he genuinely was having a laugh. And he said to me, no, does it look like I'm having a laugh? Get in the back of the car.
At the police station, Rizwan found it was indeed no laughing matter.
And he said, are these your house keys? And I said, yeah, these are my house keys. Are you going to raid my house? Are you going to break my door down? What's going to happen? Please, my family are decent people, don't do this.
Did they find anything?
Yeah, DVDs of Britney Spears and Shaggy from the 90s. Lots of paperwork, bus tickets, receipts from local shops, buying, you know, for my mum's chapati flour or something like that.
Under some of the strictest counter-terrorism laws that Britain has ever had, the police could apply to hold Sabir without charge for up to 28 days. Eventually, after 6 days, the police conceded that there was no case against him. The university had reported Sabir for downloading an Al Qaida training manual from the internet. Yet he had been studying terrorism and had accessed the material from an American government website. But how could the university say you had no business to be in possession of this document if you're researching counter-terrorism?
Well, it remains an enigma. If you're researching a topic or a group such as Al Qaida, one of the documents you were going to have to consult, regardless of what you're researching about them, is their military tactics. So which other document to get rather than their actual training manual? They're from a legitimate source.
The university said that the police were called in on the basis of reasonable anxiety and concern. The police also defended their actions. Rizwan Sabir is outraged at the way he's been treated.
The fact is that I was Muslim, and therefore it didn't mean anything of who I was, what my past was, or what I was saying. That was grounds enough to suspect me in the strongest possible ways, and that made me angry. Until this day, it still makes me angry that they can do this, and they do this.
The intelligence-gathering aspect of Prevent has angered many, but it's only one part of the government's counter-terrorism policy. Britain's tough anti-terror laws are targeted at those elements of Generation Jihad who support or glorify violent extremism.
More American soldiers! We need more British soldiers! We want them killed!
The danger is that these laws may make those jailed under them even more radical and extreme.
From the top, la 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 la. La, 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 la,
Rizwan Ditter is from Halifax in West Yorkshire. In 2007, he was arrested for downloading jihadi videos from the internet. He pleaded guilty to possessing material likely to be of benefit to terrorists and served 2 years in jail. He's now out on licence with strict conditions.
I can't leave the address that I'm registered to be at between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I had to dedicate a mosque that I'll be going to regularly on Fridays, just so they know where I am. And then at the same time, that mosque that I attend, they put cameras in there. And the imam was approached and he was spoken to, and my case was shown to the imam, and they go, this is the guy, and he's going to attend your mosque, and that kind of thing.
Ditter holds extreme views that most British citizens would find deeply offensive.
For me to say I have allegiance to UK or to Britain or I'm a British citizen, it's like a split in a lot of people's face, because the blood has not even dried in Iraq or Afghanistan and in a lot of countries.
Ditter wasn't prosecuted for his views, but for possession of extremist documents and DVDs. Possessing material of this nature can be a criminal offence.
If you showed me any form of firearm, I couldn't clean it, I couldn't load it, I couldn't fix it if it locked up with you. I couldn't do anything to it. But yet, they classify me as a terrorist. Why? Because not only is it a case of firearms and weaponry, it's about ideas and thoughts. Once when you become too loud and you challenge the ideas and thoughts, that's when it becomes problematic for you.
The Act is relatively new and has been tested on every case before the courts. But we do think that what there has to be is an intention to share, distribute, use, facilitate with the information. Simply possessing the information isn't in itself a criminal offence. What we do is look at each case on its merits.
But there is a risk that the effect of the new terror laws may only serve to harden the views of the extremists.
I'm looking at the Muslims and thinking, you are now being ostracised, you are now being targeted. There's a witch hunt going against you, and I'm proof of that. You know, I know what happens. I know how the Muslims are treated in the UK. So you can go to any youth on the street and say, do you believe in jihad? They say, yes. Do you believe that Al Kaida are a terrorist movement? They say, no.
And locking up extremists presents the government with another set of problems. Ditter served part of his sentence in the high-security wing of Belmarsh Prison in East London.
In Belmarsh, it was just me and my co-defendant. But when we first arrived at Belmarsh, we were put on different wings. So it's just like anywhere, it's like moving to a different neighbourhood. Naturally, I met with the Muslims in there that are in on terrorism charges.
Alias Kamani is a youth worker who has mentored many young Muslims convicted of terrorist offences and is concerned about what happens to them in prison.
Well done. The experience of Belmarsh is that it's a polarising place. It's a place which actually adds a sense of grievance, injury, reinforces all those factors, okay, which kind of led to them going in, which actually, rather than allay some of their kind of extreme notions, actually added to them.
Reinforces them?
Yeah, it's a radicalising place in itself.
Although we tried for a year, we weren't allowed to film any of the government's initiatives to tackle radicalisation behind bars. Prevent is getting £140 million, but barely £6 million goes to prisons. The real focus of the Prevent strategy is on the grassroots of the wider Muslim community.
If we're to be successful in stopping bombs, we've got to get upstream and prevent people from wanting to plant them in the first place. And that's why Prevent is so important.
Getting upstream means looking at why some young Muslims may be drawn to extremism in the first place. Some of them, born and bred here, have little in common with their local mosque.
But they can't find anyone to actually give them guidance, because they can't go to perhaps imams in mosques, because many imams in mosques are older, they are from South Asia, perhaps there are communication issues and they can't communicate to them as well.
The West Midlands are home to some of the largest of Britain's Muslim communities, including a fair share of extremists. It's here that attention has focused on the role of Britain's imams. The Black Country Imams Project is an ambitious scheme to make the region's religious leaders more relevant to young British Muslims.
When we started the lesson, we asked you to introduce yourselves, okay? So, for example, I teach Arabic, or I lead the prayers. You won't say I, will you? No, you say he teaches, or Imam Ijaz leads the prayers. Okay.
Imams from Pakistan have been slow to integrate into British society, content to live and work in the language of the subcontinent, and that's not English.
Where does your partner work?
Do you find this difficult?
I teach.
Little. I try reading and writing. It's a good class. It's a good teacher.
Good. And how long have you been in England?
England, 22 years ago.
22 years?
Yes.
And you're only just learning English, are you?
Yes, learning English, in this class.
But this is the first time you've learned English?
Yeah,
first time.
Yeah, first time.
Although you've been here for 22 years?
Yeah, but I'm busy in the mosque.
And the people who come to worship at your mosque, do they speak English?
In the mosque, it's no speak English. Speak my language, Urdu, Punjabi. Yeah.
There's no doubt that these imams will benefit from learning English. But should the government be paying? And what's it got to do with fighting terrorism? If these imams come across a couple of hardcore jihadis who are committed to the jihadi cause, do you really think that any of these imams can persuade them that they're wrong?
Well, the prevent strategy is not about dealing with the people who have these very extreme views.
Yes, but it is.
Yeah.
Prevent is also about convincing people with extreme views that the views are wrong. That's exactly what part of Prevent is about.
Yes, these imams are very highly trained in their own field, and what we want to do is to ensure that they are able to communicate the knowledge to our young people, and to be able to do that, they need to improve their English language skills.
I teach the Holy Quran every day.
Two questions arise from what I've seen here in the Black Country, and I was surprised. First, why has it taken 20 years to recognise that imams ought to be able to speak English? Second, would any of those imams, all of them from mainstream and moderate mosques, ever be able to engage with radical young British Muslims who are part of Generation Jihad? When Qasim was asking questions about his Muslim identity, he didn't get answers from his local imams. Instead, he set off on a journey of discovery that nearly ended in his death. We've changed his name, and his words are spoken by an actor because his life could be at risk. Qasim's quest began in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks.
There was a lot of coverage on the news, in the media, about Islam, about radicalization and about extremism, and a lot of bad press against the Muslims. I realized that, look, I'm a Muslim as well. When they're talking about them being Muslim, my religion, I wanted to find out more about it, to see what Islam was really about. Because up to that point, I didn't have a clue.
What Qasim really wanted to find out about was the true meaning of jihad, but he couldn't find enlightenment in British mosques.
I couldn't speak to many people about jihad because nobody wanted to talk about it willingly. So most of the time I studied myself, made my own interpretation of it, and listened to extremist preachers. I got influenced by the wrong people.
Not even satisfied by listening to radical clerics, Qasim packed his bags and headed to the tribal areas of Pakistan. There he met senior Al Qaida leaders.
They were fighting jihad in Afghanistan, primarily to get rid of the foreign forces there. And then the ultimate goal was to establish the Islamic Sharia Caliphate. And once it was established, they would turn to Pakistan and other Muslim countries.
But Qasim's flirtation with extreme Islam was cut short when a Hellfire missile was launched from a US Army drone.
I thought that maybe I was dreaming and was having some kind of nightmare. But then I realized that I couldn't move because the house had collapsed and the rubble and everything was on top of me. When I opened my eyes, I could see people running about, shouting and screaming. I was covered in blood, and there was blood everywhere.
Up to a dozen jihadis were killed in the attack, but Qasim miraculously survived. When he was discharged from hospital, he was asked by Al Qaida to go back to Britain and Europe and carry out attacks there.
I realized that they don't need manpower to fight in Afghanistan. What Al Qaida really needs are foreigners who do operations abroad. I made up my mind that this wasn't for me. I thought, killing innocent people, women and children, it was against the principles of Islam.
So Qasim headed home to his family. From what he's seen during his time back in England, Qasim believes that little has changed for young Muslims like him looking for answers.
Despite all that's been said and done to try and deter young Muslims from following the path to jihad, you say nothing has changed?
I think the only thing they've done is made them more underground. You know, before you can go to the mosque and ask your imam to tell me about jihad. I'm thinking of doing this. Is this the right thing to do? But now they're going to be afraid to even talk about jihad in the mosque because they might be seen as glorifying it. So I think it just gives more fodder for the extremists out there to attract more recruits.
Where are the safe spaces that young Muslims can have discussion about these really critical issues? Where can they talk about jihad? Where can they talk about armed resistance and when armed resistance should be allowed and when it shouldn't be allowed? It was really interesting what young people would come up to me and they said, you know, can we talk about J? I said, what's J? Can we talk about J? Because they don't even want to talk about, they don't even want to mention the word jihad in case someone's heard them and then they're going to be labelled as radicalised or extreme.
If anti-terror legislation is creating a climate in which discussing jihad seems risky, in Rochdale, Lancashire, Prevent is trying to open things up. Madrasas are similar to Christian Sunday schools. From the age of 4, many Muslim children spend around 2 hours each weekday learning, amongst other things, how to read the Quran in Arabic.
Good.
As such, madrasas are a potential battleground for young hearts and minds.
Today's lesson on the ICE project, as you know, we've been doing this for a while now.
The imam at this madrasa is Irfan Chisti, a passionate opponent of extremism.
If they have understanding of us, then what's happening tomorrow in Manchester, Ahmed?
There's a protest.
Right, but what is it about?
It's about, like, they're against Muslims.
Right. Why do you think they're against Muslims? Isn't the answer
It's the lack of understanding.
Yeah? What does Islam teach us?
The ICE project is a Prevent-funded curriculum designed to be taught in madrasas and schools.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good answer. Talk to them. How are you going to be able to... How are they going to appreciate you if you don't actually speak to them? So communication. Things like jihad, I know that people see them as controversial, but for us as an academic institution, they are part and parcel of the curriculum and the learning. It's nothing abnormal. It doesn't ring alarm bells. Okay, today we're going to talk about jihad. It's expected that all of the different aspects of the faith are discussed, and are discussed in detail.
Do some of your students have preconceived ideas, notions of what jihad is?
I think that's inevitable. I mean, we're not living in a cocoon. Everybody, children, especially at that age, 15, 16, you know, year 10s, 11s, they'll all be exposed to the media that we're all exposed to. Somebody was saying earlier that, hey, we don't talk about jihad, but you know what? We do. That is the big word, isn't it? Jihad. Well, what's your immediate first reaction to when you hear that word? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Terrorism.
Terrorism. Yeah? Did you have
Suicide bombings.
Suicide bombings. Glad you said that. What comes to you? War? As in, like, fighting? That's why I say that it's even more essential that we give them the facts, as it were, which are rooted in religious texts. Some people who say, look, we're going to react to that force by suicide bombing, just look at that verse there. Do not kill yourselves. Can it be any clearer than that?
No.
Right? Absolutely solid. And then the next one, Do not make your hands contribute to your own destruction. In other words, don't use your hands to destroy yourself or others. Absolutely crystal clear that, for example, what we've said there on the board, suicide bombing, cannot be in any way, shape or form a jihad.
If the Quran, as you say, prohibits suicide bombing, how do some people justify it?
Their simple answer is that that situation doesn't apply here. We're in a war situation, and in war, basically anything goes.
But who decides who's right? Whether you're right, the people who subscribe to your view of this, or those who say in a war situation this no longer applies? Who's right?
Classical interpretations, classical understanding of generations of scholars who've given us the understanding of these verses. Is that when the Quran talks about...
Above all, ICE is designed to present British Islam as the government wishes to see it. That's why the government is financing it. But there are sections of the Muslim community who are deeply suspicious of any government counter-terrorism-related initiative. And that's why they see ICE and similar prevent programs as being tainted. They believe that the government has no business in interfering with the way in which Islam is taught and interpreted in Britain.
The government interfering with Muslims and the way that they practice their religion or what schools they affiliate themselves with, for me, is quite problematic. That's for the person to decide. And the state has actually no right to interfere with Muslims and what kind of Islam that they follow.
My investigation into Generation Jihad began in West Yorkshire with the story of Hamad Munshi. Radicalised by extremists on the internet when just 15 and arrested during his GCSEs, Munshi is the youngest Briton ever to be convicted of terrorism offences.
Please pray for me that I get martyred in a state of true faith.
His family and friends were shattered by what had happened.
Hamad was definitely radicalized. I mean, look at him, he's 15 years old, he's a young kid. Hamad was groomed and it was done intentionally. They knew exactly what they were doing with Hamad.
Munshi was part of a global network of young Muslims, often just teenagers working on computers in their bedrooms, some of whom came close to carrying out horrific attacks. The question is, can the government's national strategy prevent the next Hamad Munshi from being radicalized and groomed?
I certainly have a lot of major concerns about the government's prevent strategy. I think a lot of it's cosmetic. I think a lot of it's misdirected as well. I think a lot of it is politically driven to give the appearance that significant action is being taken to allay maybe public fears as well. But I think very little of the prevent work actually is bottom-up. Really reaches those individuals which are regarded as at risk or vulnerable to violent extremism.
After the 7/7 bombings, the government had to act decisively to prevent violent extremism and stem the rise of Generation Jihad. But Britain's Muslims, whose support is vital for the success of Prevent, are far from united behind the strategy. Many of them feel that they're being unfairly targeted and stigmatized. The risk is that far from rejecting Generation Jihad, government intervention may drive many young Muslims to join it.